Welcome to yet another episode of the NewSpace India podcast. There has been a lot of commercial space activity in China over the last 5 years, especially with the rise of several new space companies. I hear that there are about 100 new space companies in China that have started over the last 5 to 7 years. There has also been a lot of speculation on the value of the investments that these companies have raised, and some numbers put it beyond $3 billion. Given that Chinese space sector is ruled by the government, much like India, where the Chinese government controls most of the activity that is in either building launch vehicles, satellites, or providing services, and only some part of it is run by private sector players who are providing some very niche services. I thought there is a lot of similarities between what is happening in China and in India. But there's also a sense of fear of missing out by thinking that the Chinese are way ahead of us trying to kick off new space in India. To get clarity in all of this, I'm talking to Irina and Bhavya Lal, who are researchers at the Institute of Defense Analyses, Science and Technology Policy Institute, based in Washington, D.C. Irina and Bhavya, along with her colleagues, conducted an extensive study to map the Chinese commercial space sector, and especially new space, by looking at original documents in Mandarin and also visiting China and many of the companies to understand the status on the ground. This is a 2-hour long episode that is packed with several insights that are fascinating. The full report produced by the IDA, STPI, is available in the show notes, which you can access and download the report for free. I hope that this episode clarifies the understanding of the Chinese new space sector against that of India, and maybe the listeners can take a lot away from this comparison as to what we can do better for new space in India. Bhavya and Irina, welcome to this episode of the NewSpace India podcast. Having read your report on China, I was very excited to have this conversation with you, and I look forward to learning a lot from this episode.
Hi, Narayan. We are excited to be here ourselves. We look forward to talking about our report and anything else you'd like to talk about.
Okay, let's actually begin this conversation by learning more about what is the organization you work for and where you're located.
Sure. So Irina and I work at the IDA Science and Technology Policy Institute, which is a federally funded research and development center that was created by the United States Congress to support the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. We are located in Washington, D.C., in fact, right across from the White House itself. Or STPI, which is what we call ourselves, provides objective and data-driven insights to sponsors in the executive branch of the U.S. government. In recent years, we have explored global trends in several subsectors of space. We looked at global trends in space, generally across the board in the world. Subsequent to the overarching trends report, we wrote one diving into global trends in the small satellite sector. We examined global trends in SSA and STM. And we recently completed a report on global trends in on-orbit servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. And of course, we evaluated the Chinese commercial space sector, and we are excited to talk about our work today.
Irina, tell us a little bit about yourself and, what's your background, and then maybe Bhavya can talk about her profile and her experience and expertise.
That sounds great. So I grew up in the United States with Chinese parents, so speaking Chinese. And then I studied environmental science and then political science in Sciences Po in France and then Columbia University in New York. I currently work as a science policy fellow at STPI, where I've worked on many China S&T related projects. And on the China Commercial Space Project, I was able to use a lot of my native Mandarin skills to conduct primary research and interviews.
So, unlike Irina, I actually grew up in Delhi in India, and I came to the United States to study nuclear engineering at MIT. And that was actually 35 years ago, believe it or not. After studying engineering at undergraduate and graduate levels, I felt that if I want to make the world a better place, the levers are in the world of policymakers. So I did a PhD in public policy and public administration. I first started to work at a policy research and consulting firm called Apt Associates in Cambridge, Massachusetts, very near where MIT was. First, I was an analyst there and ultimately the director of its Center for Science and Technology Policy Studies. After that, I was the president of C-Steps LLC, which is a science and technology policy research and consulting firm, also in the Boston area. And of course, as I said earlier, now I work at the Science and Technology Policy Institute. Throughout my career, I have focused on providing non-advocacy-based, unbiased, data-driven advice to S&T agencies, including now NASA and other space-oriented agencies.
Yeah, you have a prolific team, I guess, doing this research, and I'm sure that that really helped you guys quite a lot. So, with respect to the China study that you guys did, you extensively mapped out the new space happenings in China and how it goes along with the other legacy space program, and compares that with what may be the future and so on. So, what was the motivation behind this project, and was it because that we hear a lot of news about Chinese new space, and then there's a lot of clutter in understanding it, and was it primarily intending to declutter a lot of these issues?
So Narayan, that's exactly right. So in late 2018, we started this project to look at the emerging commercial space sector in China. And exactly as you said, it was motivated by the fact that there is lack of reliable data on commercial space activities in China and a lot of hype. So, if you look at some of the, the recent media coverage, there's a Bloomberg News article that says China is spending $8 billion to build a fledgling commercial industry focused on sending small payloads into orbit. With the title, China's space program is coming for Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. And, it's obviously China is not spending $8 billion just on the fledgling commercial industry. Another article noted, Chinese startups are already undercutting U.S. pricing by 80%. There are no Chinese companies that have, any significant number of international customers. So they are certainly not cutting U.S. entities by already cutting U.S. pricing by 80%. Another article noted that 2018 alone, the Chinese commercial space industry received new investment totaling $2 billion. And if you look at the source from where that number was coming from, that was not even funding for commercial space companies in China, but sort of global investment in commercial space. So there's a lot of misinformation, and we thought it would be useful to do a deep dive and get some real data. And of course, we felt that the best way to do it would be to look at policy documents in the original Chinese. It makes sense to look at documents coming out of decision-making bodies in China, not just academic and other academy type institutions. And also, it was pretty important that we visit some of these companies and learn about them firsthand. So we made sure that our team included Chinese speakers like Irina, and the team also included economists and aerospace engineers. We wanted to make sure we were well-rounded in terms of understanding what was happening. We conducted field interviews with more than 20 Chinese companies, spoke to more than 40 experts. We attended conferences such as the Commercial Space Conference in Wuhan and the International Astronautics Conference in Bremen, which, of course, as you know, has many Chinese attendees and companies. We mined Chinese company websites and WeChat handles. We looked at financial information services like Chichacha, the Chinese version of it. We looked at other Chinese government business statistical databases. We also looked at news sources, Xinhua and CCTV in China, and other important websites. And again, I hope your audience will read a report and get some of the details. We tried to address 3 questions in our study. What are the factors driving the development of China's emerging commercial space sector? What are the key characteristics of this sector? And what are its strengths and weaknesses, and where do we expect Chinese commercial companies to be going in the next 5 to 10 years?
Awesome. That's actually a very extensive piece of background, and you had a lot of time and resources as well to map this out, if not extremely extensively, but at least to give an overview level estimation in the beginning. So one of the interesting points that you mentioned is this signaling from the media. of estimates of Chinese companies being having so much investment or having done certain activities or undercutting US or other markets, right? So what would be your reason to say that there's a lot of clutter and the way that people perceive activity in China grossly reflects differently in mainstream media?
So are you asking why is that the case? Why is there some level of...
Yeah, why is it that we don't really see a lot of ground truth reflected in mainstream media or even space related media very accurately?
So that's a great question. I mean, obviously, it's not something we actually formally studied in our study, but if I had to make a guess, I mean, I think sensationalization sells. I mean, it's a much better headline to say Chinese space program is coming for Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. That's just way more interesting than saying, China spends, $600 to $900 million annually, that sort of thing. So I think it's just, headlines. And also there's a general sense that China is developing very fast, and it is developing quite fast, especially in the space sector. So there's a lot of interest in Chinese activity, but it's just really hard to get really good information, partly because the Chinese government doesn't really give out a whole lot of it, so you have to work very hard to get it. You need to be a native Chinese language speaker to be able to understand most of it, and I think that's where most people kind of are unable to get to the reality.
Right. One of the news that I read was that in 2014 the Chinese government really opened up this sector to private actors, to have this new space activity go on. So, from what I understand, at least, my understanding of the Chinese space program is not so extensive. So from what I understand, so far, the Chinese government has been doing most of the activity for the last 50 or 60 years. And I don't really know how much the industry is involved. I know that maybe the state owns some industries which do the activities, but not really like private sector in doing a lot of the activity. So can you briefly talk about what is NewSpace in China? How did it begin? What was its roots? What was the background of the actors, and what is the legacy of these traditional actors?
Yeah, this is a great question. And you're totally right that the government has done all the activity for the past 50 or 60 years, except for the past 5 years, I would say. And your previous podcast episode about the foundations of China's space industry is really great because it kind of lays out the three main traditional actors, which is the China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, or CASC, C-A-S-C, the China Aerospace Science and Industry Cooperation, CASIC, C-A-S-I-C, and then the Chinese Academy of Sciences. So these three institutions have basically completed all of the government space projects, all of the famous ones that we know of, launched all of the satellites. They've been responsible for everything. And then starting in around 2014, we see the first wave of new space companies coming in. And then we see a much larger second wave of companies in 2016 and then others in 2018. And these companies are different from the traditional state-owned enterprises and institutions because they're really focused on commercial activities. They're focused on making money and finding non-governmental customers, which is the difference between them and I would say the other institutions. The background of these startups is that a lot of qualified aerospace engineers who actually have experience working in the state-owned space industry decided to leave and, really take entrepreneurship into their own hands and start their own companies. And you do talk about how there was a policy change in 2014. And a lot of media sites and politicians talk about Document 60, which is the policy change, as the opening up of the commercial space industry. But when we talk to companies about why they were motivated to, start their own space companies in China, where the industry is completely dominated by SOEs, they actually said that, they were just bored and tired of the work they were doing for these SOEs. And they wanted to do more, more creative things. They wanted do their own business activities, do their own projects without all of the red tape and the bureaucracy. And a lot of it was inspired by the success of Western space startups, such as SpaceX and Blue Origin and all of those space companies that we see in the headlines all the time. So Document 60 didn't actually have a large influence on why these founders wanted to start their companies, but it definitely gave support and credibility to these new space actors afterwards, especially when they were looking for venture capital and investment. They could say that, yes, the government has this policy out that allows for private investment in the space industry, which effectively opens up their industry. The other thing about China's new space industry that is a little bit different is that the traditional SOEs also have spin-offs that participate in the new space world. So, for example, there's X-Space, which is a spin-off of KSIC that actually focuses specifically on commercial launches. So they don't provide any launches for big government clients, and their goal is to focus on commercial launches for commercial payloads, basically.
So I want to underscore, Narayan, this last point that Irina made about commercial. What makes a commercial company? And that was one of our biggest challenge. In the United States or in the Western world, it's pretty clear what commercial is. But in China, it's basically an entity, it's an enterprise that is operated in pursuit of profit, as distinct from an organization that focuses on public policy goals, which is more of a characteristic of a state-owned enterprise or an SOE. And of course, as an example of X-Space shows, this definition can include companies that are fully state-owned. So when we had to determine if a company was commercial or not, we had three rough criteria. The first one was companies in which some private parties have taken risk, either through ownership or investment or other means, even if the majority stakeholder is an SOE. So Changguang Satellite Company would be an example of that, such a company. The second criterion was that the company has sold their products to customers or would like to sell their products to customers other than the Chinese government in domestic or foreign markets. So an example of that would be Minospace or Spacity. And the third one is the company that is a category that Irina mentioned, that even if it's a state-owned company, it demonstrates some level of independence from its parent SOE or government agency. And so sort of using that rough set of criteria, we had about 80 companies that we considered commercial.
Right, it's an extensive map. I did see that you guys made a list of the companies, available on the report itself, which by itself is quite interesting because I don't think so anybody's published such extensive listing that is available on the internet so far. At least I haven't seen it. And essentially, what is the growth that you've seen or you've able to study in the last few years? Because we talked about this brief period of the last 5 years or so. So how many companies have been added in the last 5 years, or has there been a lot of mushrooming recently? What has been like the growth trajectory of these companies, and are they spread between upstream and downstream? I see a lot of companies trying to make rockets and be the next SpaceX, but are there enough companies also trying to build like satellites, and also are there matching companies that also are in the downstream which can absorb all these upstream activity?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, I mean, X-Space was established in 2013, and it was the only, commercial space company to be established in 2013. And then you have 3 companies in 2014. And then when we did our study, which, we ended our data collection in March of 2019, we identified 78 companies. And we know we didn't identify all of the companies. We identified the major ones, but there are definitely some other companies that are, PowerPoint companies or just started that might not have a product yet, but that want to get engaged in this commercial space industry. In 2020, you might have over 100 companies at this point right now. And you definitely see how just it took off because there was just a lot of venture capital available for the commercial space industry, especially in, the 2015, 2016 timeline. And then we can talk about investment later, but there was a lot in launch, and then you see a lot also in satellite manufacturing. So if you read our report, most of the companies are involved in either launch or satellite manufacturing, as and that makes sense because it's like you need the hardware, you need the equipment first before you're able to get the data, before you're able to get the products. So everyone focused on, testing a CubeSat or like launching a CubeSat, to show off their technological capabilities. And in the beginning, because there were no other commercial space actors in China, a company had to do every single type of work in all of the sectors. So they would have to be involved in upstream and downstream sectors. They would have to, make their own hardware, operate their own satellites, collect their data and provide downstream products. So a lot of them talked about vertical integration. However, as you see this industry maturing, you see that certain companies are specializing in specific sectors. This is really the case for the grounds segment and grounds operations sector, where in the beginning, all of these companies were doing their own grounds operations and figuring that out themselves. But now you have specific companies that are creating grounds equipment and ground control centers just so that they can target these other satellite companies who are potentially launching satellites, and then, need to operate them and outsourcing the grounds communications to the grounds operations companies. And then in terms of downstream, I would say the downstream is probably the newest and the most immature of all of the sectors right now, but it also has the most potential because that's where you get other industries that are not engaged in space right now. They can be brought into the space industry. For example, like the agricultural industry, a lot of satellite companies or remote sensing companies are trying to target the agricultural industry so that they can optimize, the agricultural, when to plant their seeds, when to water and all of those things. But when we talk to those companies, they emphasize the need for new downstream actors. They emphasized how right now they're building all of this hardware and they have a lot of manufacturing capabilities, but they're not sure where that's going to go and who their customers are going to be because there isn't a huge downstream industry for space right now in China.
Right, that's something that I imagined as well, because I guess, this parallels a lot with what is going on in India as well. I think recently we see also in India a lot of this kind of downstream activity that is picking up and a lot of upstream actors, firstly being established. So there are some of the nice parallels there as well. So from the perspective of the new space actors that are, up and coming in China, what do you think that is the most likely nature of the outcomes of scaling up for some of these companies? So, for example, let's say these companies, for example, will generate these satellites and these rocket companies will fly the Chinese-made satellites and the downstream Chinese companies will use the capacity created by new space actors in China to service the domestic market? Or is this something of, what I'm trying to understand is this a largely domestic play where they say that the domestic market is really big for us to capture and we don't really care about the Western world or markets outside of China at the moment? Or, is this something where they're saying we don't really know if there's a market for us here in China, but we'll create the capacity to then, sell this abroad?
Right. So this is a great question. And this is definitely like one of the major things we wanted to figure out by interviewing companies is where did they expect their business to be and where did they want to scale up? When we talked to all of the new space companies, they were focused right now on the domestic commercial space market because it's so new, because they are quite unestablished in the global environment. They feel like they need to establish themselves in the domestic market first before they start targeting international customers. And you see this across other emerging, technology industries in China, where they establish themselves domestically first before they go to international business activities. A few companies kind of noted that their technology cannot compete with international competitors right now. And so they're only focused on domestic stuff in order to make sure that their technology, gets better and they're working on, new capabilities that they can focus on domestically before putting it abroad. But in the long term, and you see this kind of with some of the more established space companies, such as Changguang Satellite, Head Aerospace, and even NewSpace, where they are targeting developing countries as their, foreign customers. especially those in the Belt and Road Initiative and those that would be more welcoming of Chinese companies and Chinese business activities instead of the Western countries, because they know that their technology and their brand image would not allow them to enter the Western commercial space markets, and that they wouldn't be able to compete against, a SpaceX or something like that right now. So they're starting with, the low-hanging fruit, which is the developing countries that don't have any commercial space industry or maybe any space industry, and providing space assets and space products to those countries first before they even think about other things. But that is maybe their future for the next 5 years. Their future, when we interviewed them, so last year, was really still focused on the domestic space market.
And also, even when they looked at other countries, they weren't looking, they weren't trying to launch large communication satellites for the governments of these countries, right? That's something that the Great Wall Corporation does. They were looking more at universities that launch small QTATs. So they are starting small. And then, of course, hoping, as Irina said, to grow into international markets. They're very well aware that they likely won't be able to sell in the United States or US affiliated countries.
What do you think are the net positives and the major bottlenecks that these actors face as of today?
So I'll just focus on the major bottlenecks, and then maybe Bhavya can speak on the strengths. So the major bottlenecks, and we've kind of touched upon this, is the number one challenge that almost every company said was their lack of business acumen. That these people are all professional aerospace engineers, but they don't have an entrepreneurship background, right? They're not Elon Musk. They're not Jeff Bezos. They're your scientists and your engineers. So they don't know who their customers necessarily are or will be, and they don't have the best business activities. Right now, what a lot of them are doing is they're just looking at Western business trends in the commercial space industry. They're looking at Iridium or OneWeb, or what OneWeb was last year, as benchmark companies of different activities they can pursue. Because, they are quite a few years behind these other companies. So then they're like, well, we'll just watch them, where they go, where they succeed, where they find business activity. We will try to replicate it in China, in our domestic market. But there's just an overall lack of business acumen, where they can build the hardware, but they're not sure who they can sell the hardware to, or the different types of capabilities, and downstream capabilities, especially for this hardware. Another major challenge is the investment. As I said before, that there was a large investment in, 2014 to 2016. And right now there's this idea of a winter of capital, that started in 2018, where VC firms are not as easily, persuaded to invest in new space companies, because they're at the point where they're kind of trying to see what the commercial space companies out there are already doing, and their business case is not very strong. So if you're going to get VC investment at this point, it's like you need to be quite a strong player in the commercial space industry. So those that already have established themselves, will likely get more investment. But if you're a new company right now, it might be hard to get, VC investment. And then the other major challenge, I would say, is competition with the state-owned enterprises. This is just a large complaint for many of these new space actors, because they cannot sell to the government. The government will not buy products from them. The government will only buy products from the state-owned enterprises, and the state-owned enterprises are responsible for all of the government activities. So new space actors understand that, and they're trying to target different customers. But at the same time, these state-owned enterprises might see that there is a huge success in the commercial space business and also start targeting the same customers, in which case their technology is not as good as the state-owned enterprises. They don't have the resources and the human capital that the state-owned enterprises have. So that's a huge disadvantage they have when they're competing against SOEs. And then there are some other challenges, such as the China brand image is not as good. So they wouldn't be able to sell to Western countries, and they wouldn't be able to collaborate with Western commercial space industries. And there's also the restriction on foreign technologies, with the ITAR and the Wolf Amendment with the US. So they're heavily restricted in who they can target as customers or as international collaborators.
So it's not all doom and gloom. So, I mean, obviously all of these challenges remain, but, the Chinese companies do have some advantages as well. So the first one is, and I think we alluded to that at the start, is that they do have policy support from the highest level of government, Document 60 being just one example. And while they may not have financial support from the central government, to the best of our information, they do have financial support from provincial governments. They get in-kind and technical and facilities, land, launch facilities, from the national government, from the provincial and municipal governments as well. Also the Chinese Academy of Sciences and the state-owned enterprises. They have the ability to draw on state space capabilities, right? So as I said, they can launch from the government facilities or manufacture in government plants. They have the ability to draw on a broader manufacturing capability China has, generally speaking. They have access to a large, young, and well-trained workforce. And there's certainly capital, maybe not as much as we think they do, but there is a lot of venture capital there. Wu Shufan, who's the founder of NewSpace, kind of referenced that when he made a comment that, and I'm quoting, Chinese economic growth has been so fast, and in the past 2 years, space has gotten into what we call the wind window. And if you are in the wind window, even a pig can fly. So there is money to be used. These are entrepreneurial companies, and they are constantly looking for new markets, trying to innovate on cost and leveraging what we call the second mover advantage. And by that, what I mean is, they may not be doing a lot of new things. They are watching other countries, especially the United States, have certain innovations and trying to replicate them. A really good example of that is, for example, reusable engines, or some kinds of manufacturing techniques in additive manufacturing that have been proven, and now they just need to move next. So the second mover advantage is actually quite a big deal. Last but not least, they do have, and Irina mentioned that earlier, they do have potentially large domestic markets that are unencumbered by foreign competitors. This allows them to work out the bugs domestically before competing with larger, more established foreign space companies. And this is a model they have used in other sectors, right? Their bike sharing or high-speed rail are two industries where they moved out domestically and then internationally. Of course, there's some other issues around competing with SOEs, which we will get into later on.
Right, and one of the questions that I had at this point is, you guys did mention that you saw about 78 or maybe up to 100 companies that may be present today. Do you have a sense of how big these companies are in terms of scale of employees or revenue, in terms of investment maybe, or any other factors?
Yeah, so it is very diverse, I would say. You have some companies that might have, over 100 employees, maybe almost 200 employees at this point, large manufacturing spaces, and actual products and revenues to say. Then you have some other companies, that might be 2 or 3 people, or just, a founder and an idea and a dream. And they might have a large VC investment right now, or they might have one product that they know works, but they're not very established. And then they might have like large open offices where they're trying to figure out what they want to do. So it really depends. I would say the average amongst all of these companies, is hard to say also, because my guess is that there are a lot of small new companies, potentially PowerPoint companies that are coming out. And then you have maybe 10 or 20 very established companies. And these are the companies named in the media sites all the time, like Changguang Satellite Technology, OneSpace, LandSpace, XSpace, and NewSpace, and all of these large companies that have actually had products. They tend to also be the older companies too. So it's like they are, 5 or 6 years old at this point. Whereas you also have a lot of companies that are 2 or 3 years old that just got their Series A VC investments, and they don't have products or revenues yet. So I would say it's all over the place, which is similar to, other new space industries in other countries too, right? You have successful companies, and then you also have very small companies too.
When you talked about some of the backgrounds of these people starting these companies, you talked about them having worked at the state-owned enterprises. It's not very easy for engineers to come out and convince investors to give money. Normally engineers are very good at pitching technically their ideas and maybe establishing the technology baseline for a particular piece of technology. But you need at least some training in terms of convincing others to get some money from them. Do you see any kind of diversity in these founding teams and having people from business schools or even having studied abroad and coming back to China and helping these companies take off? Or are founders, mostly just technical and they have some business acumen and they've pitched these investors?
So I think most of the founders, at least the ones we talk to, definitely have very technical backgrounds. And quite a few of them actually did study abroad. So they might have done a master's or some type of study abroad where they were exposed to maybe more entrepreneurship, and then they went back to China, were working at an SOE, and then realized that, they wanted more independence and more entrepreneurship freedom. So I think that was, the case for quite a few founders. In terms of the diversity of the workforce, I would say that when they first started, and as Bhavya mentioned, VC firms, they didn't need any convincing to give money. They were just giving money to anyone that had any type of technical plan or any type of, technical expertise. Of course, now that's not the case. And you also see that now that these, the more successful companies, they do hire people with business backgrounds, with, MBAs or business acumen or startup VC experience. And they hire consultants also to get them more capital, because commercial space is extremely capital intensive, where you need all of this capital to build up your hardware before you're able to actually see a product. So I think that as they've, matured, they've definitely hired a lot more people for the business side and the marketing side. But they're still very technologically immature. So I would say most of these companies, maybe, 70% of their workforce is in R&D, and then 30% of their workforce would be in marketing and in business. And again, those are for the companies that are that have actual products or have actual plans.
Bhavya, this is for you. So you talked about, Chinese companies trying to replicate some of the capabilities that are futuristic in terms of, for example, reusable engines and so on. So did you happen to see any technology that was completely new and trying to be established in China for the first time, and that was not, as an original idea and has not been done anywhere in the world, and NewSpace in China is attempting to do that first time ever in the world?
So in the research, which was all done in the 2018-2019 timeframe, and that's an important caveat because we haven't looked in the last many months, and it is such a fast-moving sector. But in the course of our research, we did not find any companies pushing the edge of technology. Now that doesn't mean that they weren't, at par. So for example, a company called TWR Engine is developing a pulse detonation engine. And the US government has looked at this technology. This is where this kind of involves a liquid rocket motor that would need to produce hundreds of supersonic shock waves per second to produce enough thrust to launch or fly. And it sort of makes for a jarring ride, which is maybe why the US didn't pursue it. But it's a technology that the United States is currently not pursuing, but a Chinese company is. So that's something interesting. Another interesting technology is the dual pulse motor, which is a type of solid rocket that puts a physical barrier inside the solid fuel, so that instead of having multiple stages, you light it and it burns until it hits the barrier, it stops, and you can coast. And when you want to burn again, you light the next part of the propellant grain, thus reducing mission complexity. So again, this is something that we haven't seen currently going on in the United States, but a Chinese company is working on it. Of course, the thing to note here is that this is a technology that's generally used for anti-aircraft missiles. So the company may be positioning to mature a technology that maybe they would sell later on for defense purposes. In terms of developments to watch, LinkSpace, LandSpace, and iSpace are all developing liquid rocket motors with reusable flight architectures. And I think these are the companies to watch because they might present some competition to Western companies eventually. In terms of the technology, however, they are not doing anything that hasn't been done in the West, and Western companies are certainly further ahead. However, and this is a key point that I think we made before, and it's worth underscoring, they may be able to provide services at a lower price point.
Right, so that is what I would also imagine, I suppose, in all of this. Irina, you did talk about the state-owned enterprises and the relationship between the state-owned enterprises and the new space companies, this tension, I suppose, between the two of them. Is there any positives about the relationship between state-owned enterprises and new space companies? For example, do state-owned enterprises provide access to their facilities, let's say a launch pad or some other vibration testing or thermo vacuum chamber testing facilities, or something to that end where they say, this is also a Chinese company which is trying to do good, so let's just share some of our expensive facilities with them? Or is it more like how institutions behave? Normally, institutions want to protect themselves. So no matter who the other institution is, it's or is it this case where the state-owned enterprises don't want to see some of these new space companies succeed, and they want to be like guarded about everything that they have now?
To answer those questions, I think there are a lot of tensions, but also the traditional state-owned enterprises are not as worried about the new space companies. Just to answer on the in-kind subsidies is that they do provide a lot of subsidies, or in-kind subsidies to these new space, actors. But I mean, for example, like all of the launches are launched from government launch pads, right? Because there are no civil space or commercial space, launch pads. So it's like, that's just something that they do have to work with the governments and the SOEs to agree on. And then a lot of, their office spaces and their manufacturing facilities might be on the grounds of, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, where they're just, or they might be just from the provincial government where the land is, they don't have to pay rent, or their rent is extremely subsidized or stuff like that. The other thing that I originally was talking about with the tensions between, or the fact that these SOEs aren't as worried about these new space actors, is because these traditional SOEs are so large and they have all of the government business, and these new space companies are so small and their technologies, is only focused on the small satellite market, that they don't think that these new space companies will be able to enter the sectors that these SOEs are currently in. And these new space actors, I definitely think, know that too, because when we interviewed the companies, they all emphasized how they were looking for niche markets that SOEs were not in currently, and trying to innovate and evolve and take over those niche markets. And a few of these niche markets, a lot of the niche markets are in communications, especially with the Internet of Things industry and other narrowband communications markets, that the SOEs are not, they don't have their eye on that right now, and they're not focused on that right now. So the commercial space companies think that this is a place where they have the opportunity, and they're unencumbered by these SOEs to really be in that market. Also, when we did interview someone who was much closer to the government, they totally brushed off the new space actors. They didn't even think that, they had any real products, or that they were going anywhere, or had any revenues. So I would say, at the very high level of the traditional SOEs, they're not worried about the new space markets. But then at the same time, they also have spin-off companies that are engaged in these markets, right? So they, have small spin-off companies such as, X-Space from KSIC, or KSIC Hongyun, or Xingyun, or Cask Hongyan, that are engaged in the same sectors that the new space companies are engaged in, except there are not as many resources in those companies, and they don't have as many people working for those types of commercial space projects yet.
So one of the things that you need, to do any kind of space activity, for example, is access to space frequencies, or oversight for launch, for example, to have clearance of zones, and so that people are not affected in safety, or even for liability and insurance and other purposes. How is the policy framework available for new space companies to get access to such space frequencies, for example, or get access to launch sites or bear insurance? Are these very well established under some sort of policy framework or laws, or how, or are they legacy government institutions like equivalents of FCC, FAA, NOAA of the US in China?
So China has a pretty emerging and evolving regulatory infrastructure, right? So there's four areas where there is something or the other that's needed. So for launch and re-entry, in 2002, a document called, and again I'm translating here, Irina would know the actual Chinese name, a document called Interim Measures on the Administration of Permits for Civil Space Launch Projects was released, and it creates a launch approval and licensing process for civil space launches. And to some extent, it applies to commercial activities. In 2019, the government released, and again, this is a translation, a notice on promoting the orderly launch of commercial vehicles that codifies the interim measures for commercial launches. So the 2000 document does get a 2019 update that is meant for commercial activity. On spectrum, the licensing process is defined in this document, again translated as People's Republic of China Radio Regulations. And we couldn't find a whole lot of information on how commercial entities have access to spectrum. When we spoke to interviewees, they indicated that spectrum allocation is kind of based on their connections, Guanxi as I call it, but I bet it's pronounced better if Irina pronounced it. But basically, connections and negotiations is what goes on in the spectrum world. With respect to remote sensing, there is no specific policy that regulates remote sensing, and most likely it happens through launch licensing. And we do know that resolution for commercial imagery is limited to 0.5 meters. We do hear that China may release a comprehensive law on commercial space in the next 5 years, but we don't know where that process is at. Our overall assessment on this regulatory piece is that it may enable faster growth in the near term as companies can do things quicker, but in the long term, lack of stable rules will hurt growth of the commercial space industry.
Okay, so how well informed are policymakers either in the Chinese government, in the Chinese Communist Party about these new space developments? Because one of the things that you see, for example, in India is that the policymakers, honestly, I think don't care about space so much, because the state has a roadmap which is quite well established, and they are just delivering. The state agency is just delivering on some of it, but then the private sector kind of struggles to get its word out on that we exist and we kind of want to do some new things, and that's always a kind of a tension that exists, right? So is the policy making circles very well informed about new space, and if no, what is really going on?
So I think that the China policy landscape is probably very similar to the India policy landscape, in the sense that policymakers are not very focused on the new space actors and on commercial or even civil space regulations. A large part because, the only actor in civil space was basically CASC for, the past few decades. And it was the government. So they didn't need to create regulations for other actors or other, people in this sector. And this was actually a huge complaint from some of the new space companies when we interviewed them, is that they think there's just a lack of guidelines or policy from the government to provide them a sense of like what they can and cannot do. And what the restrictions on commercial space is, or what they're prohibited from doing, but also what they can do and what they should be doing, or how to go about, getting spectrum frequencies or getting launch licenses or these things. A lot of it is still, based on connections, guanxi, as Bhavya talked about, where you just have to know someone, you have to know someone in the government, or you have to know someone, who knows someone in this space in order to get the permit, or in order to get, in order to understand that your activity is allowed. So they're kind of, I think a problem is that these new space companies are a little bit timid in that they don't want to overstep on anything in terms of technology, where the government would not allow them to do that and then shut this whole industry down. Which is a huge part in why they wish they had more guidance from the government or from policymakers.
I guess what I would add to that is, while they may not be that much, possibly knowledge or deep insight into the commercial space world, there is a sense, maybe even an inflated one, that space is one area to enable economic development, create new high-paying jobs. So one reason provincial governments are trying to attract space companies to come to their provinces is that they think they can create new jobs. Of course, there's also the issue of national pride and geopolitical standing, right? I mean, there is a sense that maybe we can have a Chinese SpaceX, and again, not in the commercial world, but in other parts of the Chinese space industry, there is China's trying to get other countries involved in their manned crewed space station program, or other countries involved in their cislunar activities. Again, not related to commercial, but there is a sense of space being an avenue to create both domestically national pride and internationally a higher geopolitical standing. And then, of course, going to the specific commercial context, there is a sense that commercial developments can be spun into the state sector. There is a belief that growth of a commercial sector may inject more innovation into the bureaucracy, as it is done in the United States, they believe. And there's also a sense that, and I think Irina referred to that at the start, there's a spin-off of good ideas from within government SOEs out into profitable private companies. And there's also a sense that through these private companies, they could sell space-based services to non-Chinese customers. So there may not be that much information or insight, but there is quite a bit of interest in space as being an important emerging sector of the economy.
So Bhavya, you did mention that you said in the report that there's a possibility that the services rendered by these companies might be at a lower cost. When you mean that, do you mean that the cost per kilogram of a launch vehicle will be lesser, or for example, a remote sensing data product based on a remote sensing, or maybe not even a data product, it may be a service or an insight based service, for example, some economic indicators extracted out of satellite imagery that is available at a lower cost. So do you mean all of it, or you mean only parts of like communication services or imagery based services?
So this question you're asking is actually a really good one, and it really doesn't apply even to just the Chinese commercial sector alone, right? That's sort of the question of the day. Where is it that money can be made? And of course, yours is a subsection of that, which is, where can the Chinese make disproportionately more money? We are still trying to figure out in the United States, what are the profitable sectors, right? So we know communication is profitable. In fact, that's where most of the money in the space sector is made today. Imagery is obviously another sector where there's a lot of interest, although I think private sector customers haven't materialized to the level that was expected 5 years ago. Governments remain the main recipients of imagery data or imagery intelligence. There's hope that other areas, IoT, broadband, might be where there are big markets, but that remains to be seen. Irina mentioned earlier, OneWeb went out of business. So now in the US, at least, there's one company that's going to try to provide broadband internet. And again, even that we are not sure of. I mean, they haven't made any money yet. So going to your specific question, what can the Chinese sell more cheaply? I think as long as governments are the main customers, as long as there aren't consumer products in the space sector, the cost issue is not as dominant. I mean, obviously, yes, they can offer cheaper launch prices because of the cheaper approaches. They can offer services and products even in space, sort of small satellites, CubeSats that are cheaper. But ultimately, they are selling to governments, whether it's a Chinese government or governments of other countries. So until we kind of open up the space sector as a consumer product sector, the advantage is going to be small. Does that answer your question, Narayan?
Yeah, I would like to ask, this in quite a different way as well. So, for example, right, if you look at some of the Eastern European CubeSat manufacturers, or you look at some of the emerging space CubeSat manufacturers, especially from the developing world, you see that their products are often substantially lower cost than, let's say, some of the companies in the US or in Western Europe. So I think that one of the reasons for them is purely manpower and infrastructure and operational costs, right? So, for example, if I would have to start a company in the US, I would imagine in the Silicon Valley paying an average engineer about $100,000 a year minimum, to have the running cost of an engineer. And if I would do that in somewhere in Eastern Europe or in India, it would not be more than possibly $15,000 or $20,000 a year, right? So, and it's the other bit is of course the running cost of infrastructure and rent and many other things that go alongside when you're building a company, right? So, in my estimate, most of the companies which involve a lot of manpower in engineering and so on, so they have to price this kind of manpower cost into it, and which ultimately reflects on the end product or the service cost, right? So I was imagining that there's a case where some of these Indian companies, or even, for example, Chinese companies, could be successful purely because these costs are lower for a lot of them, and if you say the hardware costs more or less cost the same in both the worlds, purely based on these other running costs, you would probably see a service at the lower cost and them therefore being competitive.
Yes, you're absolutely correct, Narayan, that personnel costs are about a third that of the United States and China, and I think about a tenth that in India. So certainly that's an advantage that China and India have. And I'm sure those companies will work very, very hard to leverage that advantage. There's no doubt about it. And we are seeing some of this already. So there's a French company called ThrustMe, which developed a cold gas thruster fueled by a solid iodine, which is a first of a kind propulsion system for small satellites. And the best I understand, they weren't able to get any entity in the Western world to launch they basically need to do a demonstration that their thruster works. And the only entity they would find that would launch for them is this Chinese company, Spacity. So their thruster was launched with Spacity, with the Spacity CubeSat, and I don't know the details of how it's doing, but certainly, Chinese companies provide. I mean, already that's an advantage that was possible only because a Chinese company was willing to take more risk, employing an untested propulsion system, and maybe a Western company wouldn't.
And I think the other thing to add is that, Chinese companies they're currently focused on cost innovation, right? They're not, doing new technologies or being at the edge of the technological innovation ecosystem, right? They're basically, taking technologies and trying to lower the cost of them by, maybe using components that weren't made for the space industry, or taking more risks so that their technology might be more risky, but it would be cheaper. And they are very much focused on cost innovation because they've seen cost innovation succeed in other technology sectors in China, right? You've seen in a lot of other industries where they're able to innovate on costs and then therefore just become the whole market because they're so much cheaper, such as in solar panels, where they actually went too cheap. But so that is definitely one of their main focuses. And, they can do it through labor. They can do it also through their hardware. It is easier to source cheaper hardware, I think, in China than it would be in America, for example. And then the other thing is they're just trying to figure out how to make each component and all of the things they do at a cheaper rate, instead of maybe focusing on making new technologies or making new products that haven't shown actual, business value yet.
And one of the things you did mention is incentives from the local governments. Is there any analysis or perspectives on how incentives from the state, are present to the new space companies? For example, here in Europe, for example, you have some of the European Union or the European Commission programs like Horizon 2020 or other such government instruments that provide new space companies or SMEs, for example, 1 to 2 million euros in terms of grants in some technology areas, or for example, it could be the SBIR and the STTR and some of the Air Force grants that US companies have been getting. Are there any equivalents in China for them?
There are not. So I would say if the government do give out these grants, they would mostly go to the SOEs or the Chinese Academy of Sciences. These new space actors do not get almost any grants, I would say, from the national government to do space projects. But in terms of the provincial governments, the provincial governments are building, these industry bases, these aerospace industry bases, where they basically create facilities and all of the space that you need to run a company. And then they're hoping that they can attract, these new space companies to these aerospace industry bases, or even, the companies, the spin-off companies of CASIC or CAS to these, new areas. So I would say that's, a huge advantage. But I would say the grant system does not, specific grants to develop specific technologies would go to the Academy of Sciences or CASC or CASIC.
Yeah, just to add on to that, when we spoke to some of these companies, they were actually quite aware of some of these tools that are available to US companies, for example, and they would push back when we would talk about SpaceX being a commercial company. They would say, well, how are they a commercial company? 75% of their revenues come from the government. So they were in fact quite aware of the lack of opportunities they have as compared with their US and Western counterparts, and they wish that these sorts of mechanisms existed for them. My sense is, again, this is not from the report, so I should be clear that it's my personal view. My sense is that the government is just trying to let some of these companies just fight it out, sort of, figure out who's the best, and then once, a company emerges because they have either better technology or better business acumen or, better set of investors, then that's when they may start to see some government investment or government interest. But for now, it seems that it's a food fight and it's a free for all, and whoever does well will be the one who is the victor and gets government support. But that's not in our report. But I just want to be sure that this is my personal view.
Yeah, sure. One of the things that I see, for example, in India is there's not much of banding of some of these new space companies coming together to voice, their opinion as an industry together, right? So there's probably some companies that are saying in private meetings or in just having connections, as you said, in voicing them out in kind of more private channels or just face-to-face conversations on not really in the public domain or through an industry association, for example. Are there any kind of such developments where new space actors are trying to form industry associations and trying to place their set of demands as an industry for government to change?
I would definitely say there's no lobby of new space Chinese companies, basically. They're all individual actors, and while they all know each other and they all talk to each other, they're definitely not lobbying the government for specific policies, at least. And you're right. It's like, at least not publicly. I do think that, all of them talk to, government policymakers or, SOE, leaders, maybe on a personal connection basis, trying to, state their case, but they definitely haven't come together as, one industry to say these are our demands and this is what we need. And in general, I would say that's not the case for the Chinese innovation ecosystem. It's definitely, again, this is my personal view too. It's definitely what, like Bhavya said, is that the government kind of allows all of the different companies to fight it out, to see who can innovate on cost the most, who has the cheapest products, who has the best products, and then pick a victor from those companies. And you see it in other industries, how this has happened, where they definitely are all starting and they're trying to make their industry profitable. And they're all just competing, for the best things. And then, so they're not banding together as you would, as an industry corporation or something.
Yeah, why I asked that is because, you see that as well in India, where it may be also, fear of being too small, or fear of having repercussions for being public about not getting support from the government. I was just imagining, are these some of the factors as to why you see these cultural barriers, I would say, in some of these regions? Because, it may be a cultural barrier because even in case of, for example, some other geographies, let's say Europe or US, you might see some of these NewSpace actors band together and place a list of recommendations, right? That's not really unimaginable in the US or maybe even in Europe.
Right. I mean, I think your question is definitely, a great question. It's just not something we studied specifically in the report. But I mean, in general, my sense is that people do not, make recommendations to the government in any public way, in fear of any kind of repercussions or retaliation, right? So I would say that would all happen, behind the scenes. But again, we did not study this, so I don't know if that's the case or not.
Right. I mean, it wasn't a specific question we posed, and it certainly didn't emerge organically in any discussions. Nobody brought up the creation of a small satellite industry group or anything like that.
So how does the Chinese population, the people, react to NewSpace? Because, for example, if you look at some of the Reddit forums in India or, open forums that are out there, you see a lot of discussion and debate happening about NewSpace actors and how the government must be encouraging them. And there's a kind of a broad public support, for example, for some of these NewSpace actors in India, for example, right? So where people want them to see them succeed and replicate some of the successes that India has had in, in IT sector or the biotechnology sector, and kind of replicate that in the space sector. So did you have a sense of, what is the perception in the society for some of the NewSpace actors, or was it just too small?
So we didn't specifically study this, Narayan, so I don't think we can comment on it. I would say that in general, there's growing interest in China in space and science fiction. So, the Three Body Problem, the science fiction book, which is part of a trilogy, is getting greater traction across the board. So there's just growing interest. And of course, Chang'e 5 is going to bring back samples from the moon. There's a lot of interest in that. China is launching a probe to Mars. So I think for a lot of people, maybe they don't make the distinction between commercial space and government space. There's just a lot of excitement, if you just kind of follow general media about China's, growing leadership in space. But like I said, we did not specifically study this topic, so we don't know how people distinguish between new space and government space.
Right, so that's something that I imagined as well. So you've seen now a lot of the companies in the US and Europe that have had a legacy of being in NewSpace for 10 plus years now. There's a lot of consolidation happening. Some of them are folding, some of them are having some exits through getting acquired or so on. So how does that look like in China at the moment? Is it the ecosystem is too young for any kind of exits, or are there deaths of some of these companies? Or
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is something that we also wanted to know and wanted to figure out. So we did ask, companies and subject matter experts about the exit landscape. And for the most part, it's just because the industry is so new and the idea of commercial space is so new that the exit landscape is quite unclear. We asked if any companies have failed. And, it was mentioned to us that there was one company that had failed and had gone out of business, just because they, spent all of their capital. But it's very hard. And that's because they knew people from that company that they were able to tell us that, one company has failed in the past 5 years. But it's also very hard just to tell when a company, folds or fails, because their website still might be up, they just might have less activity. So I would say just in general, the exit landscape is just very unclear for China right now, in the commercial space sector. And we'd probably see in the next, decade, in the next 5 to 10 years, you would probably see companies consolidating together, or companies, just kind of going out of business quietly, because I doubt there would be a company who files for bankruptcy and then, makes the media news being like, this company failed.
so we know that you touched upon this as well, Irina, and Bhavya, you too, that once something happens in China and they get an act together in one part of an innovation in one part of a value chain, they're really good at it in terms of optimizing cost to performance. Cost to performance, the smartphone world is one of the best examples for it, where you see, Chinese companies creating kind of cheaper products initially, but then optimizing performance of them. And today, some of the best smartphones in the world come out of the Chinese companies, and they provide one of the best like cost to performance ratios out there. So will this kind of how will this happen in the new space or the space world? Do you see this also happening in the space world, where they say that these companies are trying to find kind of a footing at the moment, but then once they find a piece of technology that works for them and a particular piece of service, do you think that there are indicators that tell that they can be very competitive around the world, or is there anything that sets them apart from any other companies or any other ecosystems?
I mean, I think this is one of those areas where most companies are way too embryonic to have successes. And when we spoke to them about, can you tell us more about your business plans, or can you tell us more about who your customers are, or what your future market plans are, we really didn't get a sense that many of them knew that. I mean, obviously there's probably some companies, especially in the launch sector, where there's a lot of sophistication. But for most companies that are 2 to 3 years old, they are many of them are struggling, and some of them obviously are gaining their footing. But I think we need to wait to see where what it is that might emerge. I mean, even for companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin, it was they were both created in 2001 and 2002 respectively. So it took about 15-20 years before they could go to a point where they had a critical mass. So I think, obviously the Chinese companies will grow faster because, one, they have seen, they're replicating success, right? So they're not creating things from whole cloth. They know that reusable engines will work. It's just a matter of, doing it and having enough experience that you can do it consistently. And we just have to watch. I mean, there are some disadvantages that these companies would have that really are important to note, right? So policies from the US and other Western governments would be such that they will not be able to sell in some of these markets. They have to try harder to survive in domestic markets and markets in the developing world. Maybe they can do more in the Belt and Road countries. However, that's where they are going to be competing with the state-owned enterprises. things like export controls by Western countries are already quite tough. So it is unlikely that more restrictions will hinder the commercial space sector. So there's a lot of things we see on the wall, the writings on the wall, but we just need to kind of wait and see how it evolves.
I think, like, to add that the fear that they will find something in the value chain and then innovate on cost on that specific thing and then just take over the entire market is a real fear, at least in America, which is why you get all of the, media news articles saying that China is so far ahead and China has so much money in this commercial space thing, because they have had a lot of success in, as you said, the smartphone industry and other industries where they're able to just replicate success, innovate on cost, and then just totally kick out all of the other international competitors. So that, I think that fear is real. We haven't seen it in the commercial space sector yet. And then, as Bhavya also said, there's a lot of, regulations, especially from the US. And you kind of see it with Huawei right now and the US government. It's just that, even if they are able to innovate on cost, would they be able to export their goods and services to international markets at this point? And that's, that's the challenge of the brand image issue.
And again, just to reiterate something I said earlier, as long as space markets remain government dominated, it's sort of one direction. And if space markets do become more consumer dominated, then China can really leverage some of its core capabilities, rapid mass production, skilled space industry workforce, ability to develop products very quickly, things that they have done in the telecom and IT sectors. In that case, commercial companies would likely fare much better than other Western companies. But the scenario is very specific, that space is a market which has a lot of customers, including consumers and individuals, not just governments.
So one of the interesting areas that space, new space, at least for example in India, I think has scope is integration into like defense requirements, because India has, for example, 6 times less number of operational space assets than China has, according to some of the latest estimates. I imagine that state-owned enterprises also cater to the defense requirements, and they may not be, much of a distinction between defense and civilian assets in China. I don't know how that really works there. But is there any indication that, armed forces and the military in China would be interested in new space as it is now, for example, with the US Air Force in the US?
We didn't specifically look into this, and it certainly didn't emerge in any of the discussions. So I'll say my thoughts, and Irina, feel free to jump in. The sense some of these companies have is that SOEs are the ones that will be addressing large government markets. They don't see themselves as being able to plug in. Again, they complained about that, and they did bring up the fact that the US government is so supportive of small companies supporting the defense enterprise. But again, they may be being modest, they may not know some of the details, but I did not get a sense that they were aiming for defense markets. Irina, I know you've talked to companies I didn't talk to.
Yeah, I would generally say they're not targeting the government as their main market right now, because they know that it's completely dominated by CASC and CASIC. And specifically for defense and military space capabilities, that's completely done by CASIC. So they know that this market is not easy to get into, which is why I would think that they aren't catering to those defense requirements. But that may change in the next few years, right? If suddenly like the defense industry in China opens up to commercial actors, then that would be completely different. But I think in general, the entire defense industry in China is it's all government owned and government operated. None of it is available to private actors.
So you guys, your folks did mention about, the kind of companies that there are, companies trying to build rockets or satellites or ground stations or imagery-based services. In your survey of these companies, did you happen to see any areas in upstream or downstream of the ecosystem where there was possibly no innovation or large gaps? Some areas that have no companies at all?
So the sectors we identified, was like launch manufacturing, satellite manufacturing, remote sensing, communications, the ground segment, and some downstream activities mostly related to remote sensing. So I think those are the main sectors. And, there are, industries, there are certain sectors that exist in other countries that may not exist in China, but China does the commercial space companies do hit all of your main commercial space industries, right? I would say one difference is that in China, the sense that remote sensing, the potential for remote sensing in commercial space is much smaller than it is in the US. That most of the satellite operations companies are focused on communications or the communications market, just because China has a huge population, so they have a huge need for communications amongst all of these people. So they're really focused much more on communications than remote sensing, which is not necessarily the sense in the United States, I would say. Another thing that they kind of are not focused on is that they're not focused on they're not focused on the large satellite market. They're all focused on small satellites right now. And I think that's a result of their technological capabilities, that they just don't have the technical expertise to launch or to build large satellites at this point. So it might change, in the next decade or so. But the other reason that they are focused on the small satellite market is because, CASC and CASIC dominate in terms of the large satellites. They have that capability to create, launch, and manufacture large satellites. So if they were to build larger satellites, they would have to compete against SOEs more head to head. So I think so they're all focused on the small satellite market as of right now. And I think those are the two main reasons for that.
Right. And from what I know, there are, of course, some of the established private companies in China. They may not call themselves new space companies, but they were, of course, a lot of the companies like 21st Century Aerospace Technology that operates a fleet of remote sensing satellites, and Head Aerospace maybe that also has acquired some of the companies in Europe and has assets in France and in the Netherlands and other places as well. What is their relationship with NewSpace, if there is any, and do they view them as some sort of a competition, or what is the dynamic between them?
Right. So these companies that you've talked about, the established private companies, they've also ramped up their commercial space activity. I would say beforehand, Head Aerospace or Zhuhai Orbita, had very limited business activities. They were mostly just companies manufacturing, small components for large space SOEs. And they weren't, building or operating their own satellites, I would say. And 21AT was also only focused on, certain limited remote sensing activities. But, since 2014, 2015, this timeline, these companies have become much more engaged. They now have plans, to manufacture whole satellites themselves, and they're seeking to operate their own satellite constellations. So they're engaging as much as other new space companies that we've seen that were established, maybe later, but they're engaging in the same types of business activities, and they are definitely part of the new space industry. They've pivoted a lot of their business activities. And you see this with other companies too, such as CCT Satcom or Tatua Smart Tech, where they were not in the space industry at all. They were in the electronics industry or, other technology industries that did not relate to space at all. And then suddenly they have entered the commercial space industry and now also are participating in this industry in the hopes that, they're pivoting from technology that is going to be obsolete soon into the space industry, which they think will be much more relevant in the future.
When we were doing the project, one thing we heard from the small companies was that even for constellations, they were focusing on IoT or other sort of, narrow bandwidth applications, and broadband was something that they would never consider. It was just too expensive. So they never thought they would be, competing with SpaceX for, broadband constellation. But just in the recent weeks, and, our project is well over by now, we have seen at least one company wanting to develop a broadband constellation. So things are moving pretty fast and also changing. As they maybe get more venture funding, maybe potentially more support from the government, and also just moving up the capability curve, right?
Yeah, I also did see that one of the automobile manufacturers, I think Geely, also now has a space division, and they started hiring hundreds of people and are looking to establish their own satellite network in as well. That's also something fascinating, because you have now a non-space actor but an established actor from a non-space sector now entering space and seeing value there to be extracted.
Yeah, I definitely think it's really interesting that these companies, who are very established in their own ecosystems and spheres, decided that, space would be the next big thing, and that they wanted to invest, in it right now before, businesses have really shown that, commercial space is successful and profitable on a large scale, because these companies are very large, and to, start pivoting towards this new sector is very interesting. But again, they're doing it to, remain profitable and remain, relevant. Because, certain technologies are becoming obsolete. Certain component manufacturing and whatnot is becoming obsolete. So, and space is new, especially in China. The domestic, commercial space market is completely new in China.
And this is a thing that's not just true for China, but the United States and other countries as well. There's a sense of this, coming $1 trillion economy, and everybody wants a piece of that. Neil deGrasse Tyson, this noted astrophysicist, said the first trillionaires in the world would be those who are mining asteroids. So there is a sense that there's just money to be made in every corner in space, and China wants to be part of that, and good for them. Good for all of us who want to do that. I was going to make one other point. We were talking about any areas where there is we didn't see commercial companies. I would say asteroid mining, we only saw one company maybe, and that's potentially a PowerPoint company, and also cislunar. So in the United States, there are plenty of companies, small companies, startups that are looking at the moon as a place to focus. I don't think we saw any commercial companies in China focusing on the moon or cislunar activities.
I have a completely stupid question to ask at this point of time, which is why are some of these names of these companies so funny? Because they're like X space and space T and land space and whatever names. Are these bad English translations of Mandarin, or are these ridiculously bad names given by people of these companies?
Actually, this is a great question, because it totally bamboozled us when we were trying to figure out these companies, why their names were, just so bizarre to us. Well, they were bizarre in the sense that they were all very, very similar. They all have space in them, and they're all kind of different combinations of SpaceX, honestly, at the end of the day. Like, you have X space, which is, almost just the exact, you just put the X in front of the space. The thing is, when we try to research these companies using their English names, you just find very limited information. And then you realize that their Chinese names are completely different. Their Chinese names, mean totally different things. They phonetically sound totally different. So then they created these English names to create catchy names, basically. And then to try to kind of imitate SpaceX. So that's why you have like Space OK, One Space, Land Space, I Space, X Space, all of these names that have space in them and maybe one other syllable, so that it's extremely catchy. But then it makes it very hard for the researcher to do any work, because then it just seems like they're all the same company. And then at the same time, they all have their own names in Chinese that mean completely different things. So it's very hard to associate one from the other.
And I think part of the heavy lifting Irina and other colleagues did on the project was try to kind of map the Chinese and the English names and kind of align the information that was being made available on their Chinese WeChat handles and their English websites. Actually, one interesting point, and Jen, Irina, maybe you can expand on this. We found that many companies didn't have websites at all, and we wondered if that's because they are not looking at Western markets or customers, and maybe there's sort of other thinking behind how they decide to disseminate their products or services. Irina, do you want to comment on that?
There are definitely a lot of companies who, even when they did have websites, their website would be bare bones, but then their WeChat handle would have just so much information on it. And I think that just speaks to the prominence of WeChat in China and how more people are mobile users than laptop users, and that WeChat is just so much more prominent than an internet browser at this point. You can follow, different companies, different people, different activities, all on WeChat, and everything is done from WeChat. So there are a lot of companies that, only post in WeChat and Weibo, which makes it harder, again, for the English speaker or, a US-based person to delve into what these Chinese companies are actually doing, because these Chinese companies aren't advertising to, English speakers or non-Chinese based customers at this point.
So, Irina, I'm going to push you hard on this stupid question again a little bit further and asking you if there's any, does the Chinese name of these Chinese companies make sense what do they translate to?
These Chinese companies, oh my goodness. The thing is, the Chinese names, oftentimes what it is it's like an LLC name. Like, the official name of these companies in Chinese are not very catchy. So it'll have the Beijing, and then the 4 characters that are unique: space, industry, cooperation, or corporation, or something. So their official Chinese names are all very long and very similar. And then they create a catchy short name, right? So NewSpace in Chinese is Weina space, basically. And then, and that does not translate at all to NewSpace. And then it'll just be these 2 characters that change for all of these companies in Chinese too. Because they all have space in their Chinese names as well. And in terms of what these names in Chinese mean, it just means different. It's just different variations on space again. So I think, all the name creating industry in China is very fascinating, I would say, based on, they're trying to find out what's trendy, what's catchy, how to get people interested in you, how do people remember your name, and all of those things.
Right, thanks. Thank you for the explanation there. I think it's one of the questions that has been running in my mind for a while, and I got a good answer, I guess, for the first time in that sense. So we know, of course, that large markets in China are not available to Western companies and have not been available in the internet domain and so many other domains. Do you imagine this to also happen in the space sector, where Chinese companies will have China exclusively for themselves? Or is there any role for any non-Chinese actors to have a market entry into China to provide any kind of services? Or is there any kind of them already established, if I missed anything?
So I guess I will turn it over to Irina after making a short comment. So OneWeb, this broadband internet company that just recently filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, had plans to have customers in China. So I don't think it's out of the realm that non-Chinese companies will have Chinese markets. Obviously, the devil is in the details, what kind of deal they had and what are the sorts of intellectual property aspects they had to give away. We don't have any details on that, but OneWeb did have plans to sell in China. That's just one anecdote. Irina, do you have any other thoughts on this?
We asked, subject matter experts whether, American commercial space companies would be able to sell into China. And because the space industry has been so closed off to basically all actors that were not government actors for so long, that it would be very hard for any other countries, companies to come into China and dominate this space. But that may be changing right now because, as the private industry opens up, non-Chinese space actors might be able to enter China much more easily and get better deals because they can find, better collaboration partners amongst the private space actors. But when we talk to, a few communications companies specifically, because communications is so global, we ask them, how do they see this international collaboration happening? They say for the most part right now, they don't think they can collaborate with, American companies at the very least because of, the international regulations with ITAR and all of the restrictions. So it might be actually a huge disadvantage for U.S. companies in the fact that they cannot sell to Chinese companies to enter the Chinese market.
While European companies can. So we, as part of our discussion with Chinese companies, we learned that, they have suppliers in Europe. So, there's European component companies selling in China, but not American ones, or I don't know about Indian companies.
Yeah, of course. And I don't imagine any Indian companies selling to China as well, or even procuring from China in the space sector as well. So one of the interesting developments in China, of course, is the whole, artificial intelligence, quantum communication, and these kind of new areas where China is, at least in mainstream media, to have, touted to have taken lead in many of the developments there. You did speak about remote sensing and satellite imagery based services not as popular or not as well established in China at the moment. But that's an area where, AI has a role and maybe even, can generate a lot of value, I guess, when developed. Or the other one is, of course, quantum communication. People have been talking about it for a while, saying the Chinese are way ahead of everybody there and nobody else is there around and people have to catch up and so on. So how, can you briefly talk about, what is the state of the art there and how integrated can satellites get into all of this, given that I don't know if AI is looked at as a completely different ecosystem and it can merge into space, or that's something that I wanted to hear from you.
So absolutely, just to start with the very last point, AI is an area absolutely that would merge into space. So in America, the company Relativity Space is combining AI techniques and manufacturing and 3D printing to have entirely automated factories developing their rocket engines. So absolutely the case. But I would like to quibble with your assessment that China is a leader in some of these areas. There's reliable open source reports that note that China is not the leader in AI or in quantum computing or quantum sensing. The only area where they could potentially have a lead in is quantum networking or quantum communications, as you said, which for a variety of reasons the US has not prioritized. So it's an area we have chosen not to focus on. And again, this is not my area of research, so I'm not 100% sure why that's the case, but it is the case. If this is an area that gives the Chinese an edge, I'm sure they would leverage it to the extent that they can. And there was just a news article this morning on some success that they had on a small satellite and quantum computing. So it's something that we want to be watching carefully and learning from.
Recently, we had this announcement from the government of India of essentially creating a regulator called NewSpace. It was just a few days ago, as of today's recording. So this is a massive change because essentially the government is signaling that the private sectors are welcomed, and it's in fact trying to even create a regulatory institution that can help the sector take off. Is there any signal that this can happen in China? From what you've said so far, it looks like there is no such regulator in the Chinese ecosystem at the moment? And is there any likelihood that they may emerge or in China in the years ahead, so that it may give some impetus to some of these companies to be more kind of independent?
So, I kind of walked you through the 4 areas of regulation and, some effort on part of China to support the companies. But overall, China does not have a policy that would influence the private space or the commercial space sector. We keep hearing it's coming out in the next 5 years. But when we spoke to some of the legal experts in China, they said that has been set for the last many years, that it's coming out in the next 5 years. And they are not confident it will come out. So again, we don't have any sort of inside knowledge on that. We just, we are just kind of reporting on what we heard in our interviews. I don't know, Irina, if there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I would definitely say there's no comprehensive space law in general for all of space, not just commercial space. And then there definitely is no comprehensive law for commercial space. So if the government, makes commercial space a priority, I think they, maybe you see some regulatory body come out. But in general, that has not happened. And that has not happened for other industries either, where they have a whole regulatory body just for one industry, one commercial industry. So we're just waiting and seeing. And then all of the other space companies are also just waiting and seeing and hoping that some comprehensive space law does come out.
Yeah, and again, it's not so unusual. The United States doesn't have a comprehensive framework for commercial activities, right? So for launch and re-entry, you go to the FAA. For spectrum, you go to the FCC. For remote sensing license, you go to NOAA. If you want to do on-orbit servicing, there's nobody to go to for the moment. So there's a huge regulatory gap. So these are complicated things. And in fact, the countries which have newer space activities are better at doing this. So New Zealand, which just created a space agency a few years ago, has a comprehensive framework, but they're brand new, so they can. Countries that have been doing this for a while, like the United States and China and others, and even India, it's just hard. There are legacy systems in place and bureaucratic pushbacks on efforts to make any overarching changes.
So one of the questions that I had here is how integrated is Chinese space-based services by traditional state-owned enterprises into the economy? As in, for example, right now India is looking at potentially integrating satellite imagery for crop insurance in federally governed crop insurance schemes. So far, they've been using manual techniques to estimate crop yield estimates, and only now they've been conducting pilot projects and looking at the potential of integrating satellite into, the whole crop insurance schemes that are run by the government. So it could also mean that, for example, in India, you don't have space-based or satellite-based internet. It's all currently either fiber or telecommunication, terrestrial telecommunications. There's hardly any space-based internet services available in any parts of India, just because ISRO hasn't established those services very well yet. So I wanted to get a sense of how such services are integrated in China at the moment.
So, Narayan, this is not an area we looked at, mainly because the emerging companies aren't really doing some of this, right? The support that is for the agriculture sector or other sectors is probably coming from the state-owned enterprises, and I'm sure those systems are well in place. We just haven't looked. We just didn't look at them.
I also think the commercial space companies, they're not integrated because they don't have the products for these things yet. Of course, they're working, one of their things is they hope to work with provincial governments that may not have as much access to the national space assets or CASC and CASIC, and work with the provincial governments to create, Internet of Things, or the idea of smart cities, right, where everything is just all space-based smart cities, and traffic lights and all of those things are just connected through this space-based IoT ecosystem. So, that is their goal. and then and they're working with provincial governments to do that. But, you can't say they're integrated right now because those products and those services don't exist yet.
Yeah, I think so far I think the conversation is very clear as to where the pivots are, and it's quite clear that they are not looking at government as an immediate customer maybe, and then looking more to the commercial sectors possible. So how do you see this sector evolving in the next 5 years in China? Do you see massive mushrooming of more companies, or venture funding not being available anymore because some of these companies have not been successful? What's your sense of this?
So that's a really great question. As we've been saying, most companies are about 2 to 3 years old, while they are in an embryonic stage, and many appear to be struggling. They are slowly gaining their footing. I mean, it took even companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin a decade or more to become successful. And we do believe that in the next decade, a small number of Chinese commercial companies could grow to a point where they have critical mass, especially if markets that benefit from the launch and use of small satellites grow rapidly. Right now, about 5 years ago, there was a sense that, small satellites will just explode, and they sort of have, but not to the extent that was predicted. So the success of the small sat market is something we would need to watch and see. If the small sat sector does grow as rapidly as is currently being posited, the Chinese government will certainly take a greater role in ensuring the success of these commercial companies, as it has done in adjacent sectors like telecom and IT. Policies from the US and other countries will likely not have a large effect on the growth of the commercial space sector, especially if Chinese commercial companies are able to survive in domestic markets. And foreign government controls on exports and imports of Chinese products are already quite tough, making it unlikely that, if we put any other restrictions, that would heavily hinder the commercial space market in China. If the Chinese government and the large SOEs continue to dominate the space sector in China and constitute the majority of demand for future space applications, the development of the Chinese commercial space sector would likely follow the model of high-speed railroad and sort of other areas, solar power, that they have followed in the past. In such a scenario, Chinese companies would likely slowly develop capabilities by first serving the large domestic market and then expanding internationally, using the advantages they would have accumulated on the domestic market with respect to both cost and capabilities. And we have sort of hinted to that throughout our discussion. This scenario actually would favor SOEs, especially the SOE subsidiaries focused on commercial business. So this may help some of the commercial companies succeed than others. If, on the other hand, and again I have hinted to that as well, if space applications become of greater interest to businesses and households, so for example, broadband internet becomes successful, or imagery is something that individuals and companies buy to a much greater degree than they do today, China really can leverage its sort of core competencies in rapid mass production, using its skilled industry workforce, its ability to quickly develop products. And in that case, some of these emerging companies would likely fare much better, and there would be many more opportunities for them to capture the market domestically and internationally. I mean, the Chinese, they have the money, they have the smarts. There is no reason that they won't be successful in this area like they have been in so many others. I hope this answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're reaching the end of the conversation. So I would like to ask you, both of you, to kind of give an insight into what really stood out to you personally, maybe when you went into the study and when you finished it. What was kind of things that baffled you, or maybe things that you thought made some assumptions that were really grossly wrong, and then you learned through this process of having visited them and having talked to them, because I think those are some elements that might not have been very catchy to capture in the report. It's because the report is normally very professional and you have to table your views that are very professional, but it may not capture something that you took personally, right?
So I would say that's a great question, by the way, Narayan. One thing that I learned, so I focus on understanding commercial space in the United States. That's my area. So you know how they say that if you want to understand your own country, you go abroad, and that's when you get the greatest insights about your country. I kind of had that feeling when I went to China. Trying to understand the commercial space sector helped me understand the American commercial space sector much better. It forced me to see things that I hadn't seen before. What does it really mean if the investors are private but the customers are government? What makes something commercial? So I think my understanding of commercial space became much more nuanced having gone to China. I guess the second thing again, and that's obviously not in the report, the second thing that's not in the report that was really useful for me is, people are people everywhere. These are folks, the folks we met are, they're struggling, they're excited, they're nervous. They want to impress their investors just the same as as the site visits we do in the United States. So that was really interesting for me. And last but not least, I got a chance to hang out with my colleagues, Irina and Shirley. And it was really, we work in the same office and we hardly ever talk to each other. But in China, we kind of hung out and they took me to really awesome places to eat and to visit. And that was a lot of fun. I had a huge amount of fun working on the project.
I think personally for me, this was my first major China S&T related project that I did for STPI. And I just realized how much misinformation there was that we had about China, because when we first started studying this whole entire sector, we, relied on American media and American or English-based resources, but, quickly realized that there was very little information and a lot of the information seemed like conjecture. And then you see this whole different thing come out when you start reading in Chinese, or you start looking at primary source documents, and also interviewing the companies. You see that there's definitely a huge language and cultural barrier for the Chinese innovation ecosystem. And I don't think it exists solely for commercial space. I think it exists, for AI, for many other technologies where, in the West or in English-based media, it seems like we don't know what China's doing. And it seems like they're, leading, or they're doing a lot, or they're ahead. And then when you read in the Chinese media, you get a better sense of what reality actually is, and you get a better sense of what their challenges and their strengths are. So I think that was the most unexpected thing I discovered from this project, is that the language and cultural barrier with English-based media and then Chinese-based media. The other thing is, yes, going to China was great. I spent 3 weeks, basically traveling around, and we went to 6 different cities, to visit all of these companies. And you realize, these companies, and they were so, welcoming to talk to us, which was very fascinating because, we're just American research company, and it's they've never heard of us. They don't know who we are. And they're like, yeah, we're really excited about this. And we're really impressed that an American company even knows our name. So they don't realize the reach they have or how much they're talked about in the media right now, I would say, outside of China, which was all very great.
So my final question to you is there any follow-up to the study that you plan to do, or do you see any merit in having a rolling framework? You have the Space Industry Association and many other groups that are in the US that are trying to constantly monitor the US space industry and the state of the space economy both in the US, and there's also European ones as well. And given that there's so much lack of information and even misinformation on the state of the Chinese industry, I wonder if this exercise should be have a rolling framework where every year numbers could be updated, and given that an institution like STPI could do this, then there's a lot of credibility to it, and people also don't need to pay $5,000 to access that report.
Yes, our reports are free. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this is such a fast-moving sector. I already feel that our report is kind of getting dated because it's a year old now. And it would be useful to update it. Also useful to do would be better insights into workforce issues. So, I think we did try to learn some things about the kind of folks that are being hired. I think it would be helpful to better understand some of the workforce constraints as the emerging space sector faces. The financing ecosystem, who's funding these companies? Where are these funders coming from? What are the amounts of funds? We have obviously got some insights and they're in the report, but again, it's changing quickly. One thing that we heard in one of the discussions I had at the ISC was if the companies, and this is something that's international, companies tend to exaggerate the downturn revenue streams and such. And so one of the folks I spoke to said that VC may dry up if we don't start producing results and exits and such. So it would really be important to see if the exits are happening, if the companies are delivering as promised. And so doing this on an ongoing basis would be a good thing, but I'm not sure at this point if we are doing it. I hope somebody does, maybe even us.
All right, so Irina and Bhavya, I really thank you for spending 2 hours of your time, having this long conversation. I think this is one of the most insightful conversations that I've had on understanding in China, and I guess you saved me a lot of time and possibly also a lot of money in understanding China in that sense, and also I guess the listeners. So I would love to have this conversation if you're doing follow-up studies on other ecosystems as well. So and possibly even in the Indian ecosystem, if you did a study on that and had insights there, it may be very interesting to see what you saw through your lens, and then have a conversation on that as well. So thank you very much again for appearing on the show, and I wish you both the best of luck for the future.
Well, thank you for inviting us. It was an absolute honor. We really enjoyed the discussion, and we would love to do such a study on the Indian space ecosystem. So keep us posted on that if you see one that we could help with. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. This was absolutely really great to disseminate all of this information.